Okay, good evening, everybody. It is time to, uncover my camera, apparently. All right, there we go. Okay, so, a new chapter from the Hiram Key. This one is a fairly long chapter, so I'm only going to read the one. Um, Nothing else to say. I did decide not to show those pictures this time because most of them are not relevant to what we're reading right at the moment. Once we're a bit farther into the book, they'll become more relevant. They'll mean more. So I'll just maybe even wait till the end of the book before I go through them. Um, there's enough information included with each picture that you'll remember what they're talking about. So we'll just settle back in and start in on reading. So we are on. I looked up how to pronounce this, and if you bear with me, I'll look it up again because I have already forgotten. The names of there it is. Um, Sorry. There we go. Pronunciation, because I keep getting it wrong, and I know I'm getting it wrong. Yakin. So it's Boaz and Yakin Peshur. That one I'm not sure about. Pesher. So the Boaz and Yakin Peshur. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, let's get started. Enough of that. Close that out. I don't need it. Okay. Our detailed reconstruction of the development of the Jewish people over the last 5 chapters had finally brought us to the period that directly preceded the events that gave rise to the Christian church. We had delved deeply into the distant past of the Essenes/Nazarenes and had learned a great deal. On the basis of what had found out, we had the feeling that this was going to be a particularly intriguing section of our quest. So far, we had an emerging hypothesis of kingdoms being built on the power of twin earthly pillars and a heavenly lintel or archway, and we could only hope that a final proof of this paradigm would soon emerge. Of all the groups that existed in Israel at this time, that is, the period around the birth of Christ, we believe that the most important was the Qumran community that existed in the Judean hills. Although it never grew to much more than around 200 people at any one time, its influence over the future world was immense. We already had good cause to believe that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community, were Essenes, and that they and the Nazarenes and the original Jerusalem church were all one and the same. Our evidence for such a statement was already strong, and it is a view that has received serious consideration by many leading experts, but now our added insight gained from the Hiram Key was starting to put it beyond question in our minds. Our original hypothesis outlined in chapter 4 and 5 that Freemasonry had developed from this group now seemed entirely possible because of the linkage that we had found between them and the ancient Egyptians, but now we had to look for direct evidence of Masonic attitudes and rites. If we were right that there is a direct connection between Freemasonry and the Qumranians, and that the Qumranians were the first Christians, it follows that Christ must have been, in some sense of the word, a Freemason himself. We were aware that this is a notion that will horrify many modern Christians, particularly Roman Catholics, but we did indeed find the evidence that that is exactly what he was. It has long been speculated that the Jerusalem Essenes were some kind of proto Christians, and that Jesus the Christ may have been one of them. But evidence was always very thin on the ground. Things changed radically when many tatty bits of writings were, as we mentioned in chapter 4, unearthed at the ancient settlement at Qumran. Soon afterwards, the whole site was extensively excavated by the Jordan Department of Antiquities, l'École archéologique française, and the Palestine Archaeological Museum under G. L. Harding and Pelé Ardevaux in 5 campaigns between 1951 and 1956. What they found was the theologians' equivalent to sweating nitroglycerin. The world of Christianity could blow up if the whole thing was not handled with the utmost care, but the lid could not be kept on this explosive issue, no matter how hard the Christian church tried to do so. Those in charge of the research were not independent scholars. They had a faith to protect and an establishment to maintain. Other scholars involved with the scrolls saw evidence that appeared to change the view of Christ and the New Testament, but they were effectively silenced or discredited. Accusations of scandal, cover-up, and deliberate smothering of the truth have been met by denials and counter-accusations of overactive imaginations and deliberate sensationalism. It is a fact that for more than 40 years after their discovery, over half of the 800 scrolls discovered had not been published. The academic community was outraged by this unprecedented secrecy of what ought to be public knowledge, and after widespread protests led by the Huntington Library of San Marino, California, the Israeli authorities removed restrictions on public access to the contents of the scrolls in October 1991. Various versions of biblical texts were found, and all of them were over 1,000 years older than the oldest surviving Hebrew texts that were produced by Aaron ben Moses ben Asher in AD 1008. Prior to the discovery of the scrolls, the Jewish and Christian world did not know for sure how accurate our current Old Testament was. We only knew that during the Christian era, even the tiniest deviation has been frowned upon. From the great variety of competing texts, each carefully stored in the caves of Qumran, we now know that there were a large number of different texts, and that the one translated into the Greek Septuagint was just one of them. So there is no correct version of the Bible after all. The whole area of investigation concerning Qumran is a minefield for ordinary Christians. So many have preferred to keep away from the subject. Whilst Judaism and most other religions are based on a broad theme of social and theological thinking, Christianity rests entirely on the idea that on a particular day in history, a God/man absolved those members of the human race who were prepared to worship him of responsibility for their wrongdoings by dying, albeit temporarily, under torture. Until recently, the only evidence regarding this pivotal event was the 3 synoptic Gospels of the New Testament, which were written long after the events they describe by people who were not involved themselves and cannot be properly identified. It is now known that the story of Jesus told in these Gospels is to a large extent a dramatic invention to wrap up his teachings in a reader-friendly format. Analysis of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke have shown that they are an amalgam of 2 separate church traditions based on a combination of the Gospel of Mark and a lost earlier Gospel now referred to as Q, derived from the German word Quelle. I know I'm not. Quelle? Quelle, Quelle, I think, meaning source. The birth story of Jesus told in Mark and Luke is now known to be a complete invention by people who had no understanding of the historical and political circumstances of the time. The events as they described them simply could not have happened. An example of this is the way the King Herod is linked with Roman taxation under Quirinius, when Herod had been dead since 4 BC, at least 10 years before Quirinius came on the scene. Other scholars, such as Morton Smith, have detected the existence of a secret gospel with elements running beneath the 4 New Testament gospels, which is believed to predate the Gospel of Mark. We could not help but wonder if this secret gospel of Jesus did exist in a written form. It may well be the document at the heart of our mission, the scroll that the Knights Templar found. The possibility is borne out by the Qumran scrolls, which identify that there was a secret tradition that members had to swear never to divulge. These secrets were written down and preserved in readiness for the day when God would visit his people in the last times. There is little or no reference to Jesus in any recognized third-party documentation, which is very unusual, especially when such historians as Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder were recording just about everything of note at the time. As we have discussed, it is normally possible to understand historical characters through what independent sources and even their enemies say about them, but in this case, the early inventors of Christianity did a good job of removing all evidence about a mortal they wanted to portray as a god. They were not thorough enough, however, and through good fortune, the modern deductive analysis, there is suddenly a lot more information available, and the strange interpretations of the early Roman Church stand to be challenged by the truth. Christianity is uniquely exposed. There is no sudden influx of information that could fundamentally damage Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or even, for that matter, the belief system of the Australian Aborigines or the Amazonian Indians, because they are religions that have grown from a deep spiritual understanding evolved slowly out of their own cultures. I disagree on the Islam part of that, though, because Islam comes directly from Christianity in some ways. So, I'm not totally sure that I agree with him on that. Even with Gautama, Buddhism lives. Even without Gautama, Buddhism lives. Without Muhammad, Islam lives. Yet without the resurrection of Jesus, Christianity as it in that sense, I do agree with him. Yet without the resurrection of Jesus, Christianity, as it currently stands, is nothing. It is understandable, therefore, that the Church takes great care in dealing with new information regarding this tiny moment in relatively recent history when they believe the Creator of the whole universe decided it was time to become a living Jew. This leaves Christianity exposed to the light of truth. If the whole basis of Christianity can be shown to be a silly mistake, will the Vatican apologize for the inconvenience it has caused, abolish itself, and hand over its wealth and power to the chief rabbi? No. Clearly, no proof could ever do this, and maybe that is right, because the Church is too large and important to suddenly disappear. But equally, it can never be right to hide the truth, because truth must surely be the essence of God. There must be a way for the Church to survive by rethinking what it knows are mistaken ideas. There is an old Jewish story that makes the point well. At a gathering of rabbis, the wise men were debating a section of holy law, and one of them found himself at odds with the rest of the group on a point of interpretation. He was coming under great pressure to concede, but he knew that he was right, and that God would therefore be on his side, so he called upon the Almighty to help him prove his case. "Please God, if I am right, let the streams of Israel flow uphill," the rabbi begged. Immediately the waters of the land changed direction. Unfortunately, his adversaries were unmoved. "Please God," the exasperated rabbi said. Again, "If I am right, may the trees bend to the ground." And they did. But still his fellows were intransigent. "Dear God," he called out in rising frustration, "may you speak aloud and support me." The clouds promptly parted, and a great voice from heaven boomed forth, "My friends, I have to tell you, you are wrong and he is right. This is what I intended." The lone elder smiled in triumph, but the group remained unimpressed. "Oh, we pay no attention to heavenly voices," they said, because the correct determination on this point was written down long ago. This humorous story says it all. Old scriptures, however inaccurate, take on a life of their own, and ultimately, religion is not about historical truth at all. It is about faith. But in our modern world, blind faith is not enough, not nearly enough. And if religion wants to survive, it must not turn away from new information. To put dogma above truth is no way to honor God. The missing books of Maccabee. Conventional history records the Maccabean revolt as a Jewish cause with right on its side, and the raising of Jonathan Maccabeus to the high priesthood is viewed as a popular event. Whilst the first part is certainly true, we now know from the scrolls recovered from Qumran that Jonathan was considered by the Hasidim, or strict Jewish establishment, to be an outrageous choice who put politics before Yahweh. When Jonathan was murdered, his brother Simon became high priest and proceeded to take things even further by declaring his family's hereditary right to the position of high priest, a claim which he had engraved in bronze and set up in the temple. The Roman Catholic Douai Bible tells us how Simon started to see himself as a player on the world stage when he sent an ambassador and offerings to Rome. Simon's illegitimate ascension can be found in Psalm 110. The Qumran community's views of the Jerusalem priesthood are clear in the following passages from the scrolls. Quote, "The priests of Jerusalem who will heap up wealth and unjust gain from the plunder of the people." I don't know what that stands for. It's Q, capital Q, lowercase p, capital H, lowercase ab. I don't know what that stands for. I have not read the Dead Sea Scrolls or any of that. So, not yet anyway. But that is chapter 9, verse 4 and 5 of whatever that is. And then the same designation in the next quote for chapter 12, verse 7 through 9. The city is Jerusalem, in which the wicked priests did works of abomination and defiled the temple of God, quote unquote. The names used to describe the rule of the family that took over the high priesthood are confusing. The founder was called Mattathias, but the term Maccabee, or Maccabee, is used for his son Judas, and the lineage they produced is collectively called the Hasmoneans in rabbinical literature. According to the historian Josephus, this was due to the name of Mattathias's great-grandfather, Hashmon. When Simon was murdered, he was replaced by his son, John Hyrcanus, who ruled for 30 years. Then his son, Aristobulus, briefly took over and became the first Hasmonean to call himself king of the Jews as well as high priest. The line continued until roles of king and high priest split again upon the death of Queen Alexandra in 67 BC, when her youngest son, Aristobulus II, became king, and her eldest son, Hyrcanus, became high priest. The Roman Catholic Douai Bible, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and I need to look that one up. The Roman Catholic Douai Bible gives a very full story of this period of political intrigue, murder, and wholesale corruption, and it portrays the Hasmoneans as Jewish heroes, yet the King James Bible tells us nothing. The last two books of the Douai Bible are the first and second books of Maccabees, scriptures totally absent from the Protestant Old Testament. Why should this be so? The fact that these two books are missing from the King James Bible actually told us a lot. There must be a very important reason why the Catholic Bible presents the story of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean high priesthood as legitimate, and the King James Bible does not recognize any of it as scripture at all. what was wrong with these works, and what would the far later compilers of the Protestant Bible possibly have known that could cause them to drop these long accepted works supposedly inspired by God? The only people who knew that the rise of the Hasmonean high priests and kings was illegitimate were the members of the Qumran community, who despised these false high priests and their political panderings to the Romans. Yet the Qumranians were all but destroyed in the war with the Romans in AD 66 to 70. And the diaspora Jews/Christians, the seekers after smooth things, were left to tell the story the way they saw it. However, although the Qumranians may have lost the battle, they won the war. But burying the true Jewish story in scroll form, the message eventually got in. Oh, by burying, I'm sorry, I said but I mean by. Burying the true Jewish story in scroll form, the message eventually got into the hands of the creators of the Protestant Bible, thanks to the early 12th century excavations of the Knights Templar. The elect of Judah. The Jews who returned from their captivity in Babylon were led back to Jerusalem by Zerubbabel, the man who otherwise might have been their king. He and his inner group named in the Bible of Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Banah, returned to their city with their secret ceremony of the royal line of David. It was now a little different because, following Ezekiel's advice, the most overtly Egyptian elements had been exchanged for Hebrew ones, but still it was intact. As they rebuilt the temple to the design explained by Ezekiel, they were filled with a new confidence. They would build a temple and a new unshakable covenant with Yahweh. Never again would his people err, and never again would their God need to punish them so harshly. The confidence of a new beginning is always special, this time I will make it work feeling. It is human nature to find strength through hope in a future which always seems as though it will be kinder than the past, but as many experienced people know, it rarely is. It is most likely that the descendants of Zerubbabel and his inner group, known as the Hasidim, left Jerusalem sometime between 187 BC and 152 BC. The scroll called the Damascus document, so called because the community referred to itself on occasions as Damascus, gives us the best clue to the founding of the Qumran community. And then we have a long quote here. Quote, "For in their disloyalty, when they left him, he hid his face from Israel and from his temple, and he gave them to the sword. Then, when he remembered the covenant of the patriarchs, he left a remnant in Israel, and he did not give them up to annihilation. And in the end time of anger, 390 years after he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he visited them and caused to sprout from Israel and from Aaron a root of planting to possess his land and to grow fat in the goodness of his earth. Then they understood their iniquity, and they knew that they were guilty men, but they were like blind men, like men groping their way for 20 years, and God considered their deeds, that they sought him with a whole heart, and he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. And he made known to the last generations what he did with the last generation, the congregation of traitors, those who had turned aside from the way." End quote. And that is CD. Again, I don't know what that abbreviation is. Chapter 1, verses 3 through 13. If we take the reference to the Jews being into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar from the date of his first taking of Jerusalem in 597 BC, rather than the city's destruction in 586 BC, the 390 years plus the 20 years of groping their way gives us an early date of 187 BC for the founding of Qumran. This dating would not be taken too should not be taken too literally, but we can be sure that the community was in place in 152 BC, when the Qumranians were in protest at the assumption of the high priesthood by Jonathan, the leader of the Maccabees. Scrolls recovered from the caves of Qumran, particularly the Manual of Discipline and the commentary on the first two chapters of the book of Habakkuk, tell us of their particular revulsion at this appointment. Their exile was self-imposed, and in their desert retreat they saw themselves as the people of the new covenant with Yahweh, the elect of Judah, living a harsh monastic life that would become the model for Christian orders. They described themselves as, quote, the men who entered into a new covenant in the land of Damascus, end quote. Damascus is now widely considered to be the name that they used for Qumran rather than a reference to the Syrian city. Excavations have shown that the people of Qumran probably lived in tents and used the caves in the surrounding escarpments as storehouses and dwellings when sheltering from the very occasional winter rains. There were buildings which included a watchtower, public meeting rooms, a refectory with kitchens, with kitchens and pantries, a scriptorium, a bakery, a potmaker's establishment, various workshops, and large cisterns for ceremonial ablutions. Ritual washing was essential to the maintenance of holiness, so large amounts of water were required in this area of very little rainfall. The members of the community were divided into three groups: Israel, Levi, and Aaron. Israel meant the common membership. Levites were lower priests, and Aaron designated the most senior and high priest and holy priests. Like Freemasonry, any man that could express a firm belief in God was eligible to join the community, the many as they called themselves. There are a number of distinct similarities in the treatment of new members, starting with an interview with the council to examine the potential candidate and establish his righteousness, after which a ballot was taken. If accepted, the candidate was admitted at a lowly grade for the period of 1 year, in which time he must not mingle his wealth with the many. The first level of Freemasonry, that of entered apprentice, used to be of a year's duration, and in the initiation ceremony the candidate is required to bring in no coins or other metallic objects. In the course of the initiation he is asked to give money, and when he replies that he has none, he is told that it was a test to ensure that he had brought no coins or other wealth into the lodge. When the new member had been in the Qumran community for a year, he was tested on his learning of the works in the Torah. Before proceeding to the status of a fellow craft, a Masonic brother has to be tested on his learning of ritual. As with Freemasonry in the past, the second stage of membership was as far as the majority got. But for selected individuals, there was a third level to which the individual could pass after a further year. This allowed them to, quote, draw near to the secret council of the community, end quote. This reminds us of the secrets of Hiram Abif that are revealed to the Freemason that becomes a Master Mason on being raised to their third degree. As with Knights Templar practice, once initiates passed their first year, they had to pass over all of their wealth. Naturally, this is a procedure that Freemasonry cannot adopt without disappearing as an organization overnight. The positive virtues taught in the Qumran community were clearly laid out in the scrolls: truth, righteousness, kindness, justice, honesty, and humility, along with brotherly love. So similar are the 3 degrees of the Qumran community to those of Freemasonry that it transcends mere coincidence. Employing our technique of using Masonic ritual with just the few identifying words changed, it would be easy to believe that this address to a third-degree initiate was a quotation from the scrolls concerning someone who had just been elevated to the Qumranian third stage, the purity of the many. And we have this fairly long quoted text. So, quote, "Your zeal for the institution of the community of the many, the progress you have made in the art, and your conformity to the general regulations have pointed you out as a proper object of our favor and esteem. In the character of a member of the secret council, you are henceforth authorized to correct the errors and irregularities of brethren and fellows, and guard them against a breach of fidelity. To improve the morals and correct the manners of men in society must be your constant care. With this in view, therefore, you are always to recommend to inferiors obedience and submission, to equals courtesy and affability, to superiors kindness and condescension. You are to inculcate universal benevolence, and by the regularity of your own behavior afford the best example for the benefits of others. The ancient landmarks of Israel, which are here entrusted to your care, you are to preserve sacred and inviolable, and never suffer an infringement of our rights, or a deviation from the established usage and custom. Duty, honor, and gratitude now bind you to be faithful to every trust, to support with becoming dignity your new character, and to enforce by example and precept the tenets of God's system. Let no motive, therefore, make you swerve from your duty, violate your vows, or betray trust, but be true and faithful, and imitate the example of that celebrated artist Taxo, whom you have once represented." End quote. Before we consider the comparative secrets of the two orders, there are some exclusions from membership which are strangely similar to each other. A man could not join the Qumran community if he were simple or smitten in his flesh, afflicted in the feet or hands, lame or blind, or deaf or dumb, or smitten with a blemish in his flesh visible to the eyes, or a stumbling old man so that he cannot hold himself up in the midst of the congregation. End quote. Although the rule is no longer rigorously applied, Freemasonry requires that candidates must be of sound mind and able-bodied. Any physical handicap is supposed to bar admission. The community which lived at Qumran for about 250 years is often referred to by modern observers as an Essene monastery. That they were Essenes is now fully accepted by most observers, but the term monastery is misleading in that they were not a gathering of celibate males who spent nearly all of their non-working time in prayer. We can see from the library of scrolls that relate to the community that celibacy was highly regarded but not essential for membership. Nevertheless, sexual relationships were considered to be deeply soiling, and if a man had even slight contact with a menstruating woman, a considerable amount of cleansing was required before he could mix in the community. Modern Western minds love labels. We love to be able to put everything we come across into a pigeonhole. Is it an A or is it a B? We have built up so many definitions and categories that we are slightly phased if we that we are slightly phased if something is impossible to slot into a box. But the particular point about the Qumran community is that it changed dramatically over the quarter of a millennium of its existence, particularly towards its end under the influence of Jesus and James. Midrash, Pesher, and Parable. Anyone today who studies ancient Judaism is fully aware that the Jewish mind of 2,000 years ago and more was quite different to ours today, and they have to understand the techniques of Midrash, Pesher, and Parable. The term Midrash, spelled Midrash, corresponds very closely to the English word exegesis. Exegesis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and can be defined as, quote, the investigation and interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures for the purpose of discovering theological truths and instructions to be followed, end quote. This is a closely related concept to a technique of understanding current events called pesher, which can be explained as an interpretation or explanation of a verse of Scripture in which a given statement is considered to have meaning regarding an event or a person at the present time or in the future. So, Midrash was an ongoing process for the priests and prophets of Israel seeking out instruction to improve the spiritual well-being of the people, and Pesher was a method of making sense of things that were happening around them. They believed that events were not random occurrences, but conformed to structured patterns that could be deciphered through the study of Scripture. As a result of these two principles, when they wrote down a story of a recent event, they would be likely to ensure that it followed an ancient pattern. This explains why we find so many references both in the New Testament and the Qumran scrolls, which are echoes of the Old Testament. The term parable is well understood by Christians because the New Testament tells us that Jesus the Christ used this form of storytelling to communicate his morality teaching to the unsophisticated people of Judea. The method can be defined as, quote, a figurative explanation which may contain either allegory or metaphor or both to transmit a deeper level of meaning than the surface level, end quote. These stories were not only used as simple analogies to help uneducated Jews understand the law, they were also a technique of explaining complex current events in an allegorical and therefore secret way. It is a fact beyond all dispute that Christianity was a Jewish cult, and that all of its original cast, quote unquote, Jesus, James, Simon Peter, Andrew, Judas, Thomas, etc., were people who thought in terms of midrash, pesher, and parable. By contrast, what we might call the second cast, Paul, Matthew, Luke, etc., were quite different and used more Hellenistic thought processes that are closer to the way we think today. The Gospels of the New Testament were almost certainly all written after the destruction of Jerusalem and Qumran and the death of the original cast. These writings were created for a Greek-thinking audience by people who took the teachings that they believed to be those of their Christ, then wove a life story for Christ around them, without the benefit of any actual eyewitness testimony. To separate the fact from the fiction in the New Testament, we have to remove the literalism of Greek thinking and look beneath to study the undercurrent of radical Jewish and proto-Christian thought. There are fundamental similarities between the Qumran community, what the Qumran community said about itself, and what the early church said about itself. The early church was known as those of the way, or the way of God, as a distinct sect. Acts 24:14. The members of the Qumran community also used this same term to describe themselves. What is more, both groups describe themselves as the poor, the children of light, the elect of God, a community of the New Testament or covenant. This idea of the church as a new temple of God, where sacrificial redemption is made once and for all for the entire world, comes from the 8th chapter of the Epistle to the Hebrews, which quotes in full the Jeremiah passage which preceded it. Quote, an eternal planting, a holy house of Israel, a most holy conclave for Aaron, witnesses of truth and judgment, and chosen by divine favor to atone for the earth, to render to the wicked their deserts. This is the tried wall and the precious cornerstone, whose foundation shall not be shaken nor moved from its place. End quote. We cannot help but notice how extraordinarily similar is Peter's description of the church. Quote, ye also, as living stones, are built up a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ, because it is contained in Scripture, "Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect precious. But ye are an elect race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of God's own possession." End quote. This close parallel was first noticed in 1956 when it became clear that there was a very special connection between the Qumranians and the Jerusalem church. What was not commented on was how well these words also fit another organization, Freemasonry. Whilst all of Freemasonry is concerned with the building of a spiritual temple on the design of Ezekiel's view of Solomon's temple, the quote, address in the northeast corner, end quote, immediately comes to mind. Quote, "At the erection of all stately or superb edifices it is customary to lay the first or foundation stone in the northeast corner of the building. You, being newly admitted into Freemasonry, are placed in the northeast corner of the lodge, figuratively to represent that stone, and from the foundation laid this evening may you hereafter raise a superstructure, perfect in its parts and honorable to the builder." End quote. Oof. Yeah, we have a ways to go. Holy crap, we have a ways to go. Okay. Yeah, we're maybe halfway through the chapter. The secrets of Qumran. When Essenes were first forced to leave Jerusalem, we are told that they groped around for 20 years until a man known as the Teacher of Righteousness showed them the way, and the community of Qumran at Qumran became firmly established. The difficulty with the Qumran scrolls is that they rarely give us names for individuals, so identifying characters by comparison with non-Qumranic sources is impossible. Besides the Teacher of Righteousness, there are major characters who recur in the scrolls, such as the wicked priest and the liar, whose identities have provoked much scholarly debate. Whoever the Teacher of Righteousness was, he must have been a pious, holy man, and apparently was a priestly descendant of Zadok, who revealed to his community that they were living in a time that would be the end of days, as predicted by the old prophets. Soon, he told them, God would crush his enemies in a final cosmic battle and usher in the new age of righteousness. And as the community was the last remnant of true Israel, the people of Yahweh's covenant, it would be they who would fight the battle and would return to Jerusalem to purify the temple and to reinstitute proper worship. The Qumranians had several descriptions for themselves, including the community, the many, the congregation of Israel, and the sons of light. In addition, the man who would lead them to the end of the age, the Davidic Messiah, had such titles as Mighty Man, Man of Glory, and Prince of Light. It would be this Prince of Light who would overcome the Prince of Darkness and the congregation of Belial, Satan. A scroll entitled Midrash on the Last Days tells how the children of Belial will devise evil plots against the sons of light to cause them to stumble, and the kings of the nations will rage against the elect of Israel in the last days. God, however, will save his people by the hands of two messianic figures who will arise at the end of time, one from the branch of David, and the other the interpreter of the law. From the scrolls, we learn that there were in existence some secret books which contained information about future events and references to certain rituals revealed by God. These were normally transmitted to selected people by word of mouth alone, but they had now been written down in coded form. These secrets were highly restricted, and it is claimed that they had been handed down in a long line of secret tradition to be faithfully preserved until the last days. Father J.T. Millick, who led much of the early work on the Qumran material, identified that certain secret scrolls used cryptic devices. One example was the use of two different alphabets with arbitrarily chosen signs which replaced the normal Hebrew characters. Another had the script running left to right instead of the normal right to left. Everything was found out about the Qumran community. Everything we found out about the Qumran community added to our conviction that they were the spiritual descendants of the Egyptian kings and the antecedents of the Templars and Freemasonry. A major piece of evidence came to light thanks to another member of the original Dead Sea Scrolls team and a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. In many of the scrolls, Dr. Hugh Schoenfield discovered a Hebrew code that he called Atbash cipher, which was used to conceal the names of individuals. Staggeringly, before his death in 1988, Schoenfield found the key words used by both the Knights Templar and Freemasonry. That keywords used by both Knights Templar and Freemasonry are themselves Atbash codes, which reveal hidden meaning once deciphered. For instance, the Templars were widely reputed to worship something with the curious name of Baphomet, which was never understood until it was written in Hebrew, and the Atbash cipher applied to reveal the word Sophia, the Greek for wisdom. So here was a positive connection with the Templars, and one for Freemasonry followed. Applying the Atbash cipher to the Masonic word tacho, it says pronounced tacho, it's spelled T-A-J-O, which was a pseudonym supposedly given to the Grand Master in Spain, produces the name of the man Asaph, who, according to a number of psalms, assisted at the building of the first temple of Jerusalem. The subject matter of some of these mysterious works from the Qumran library concern Noah and Enoch, who were said to have been the recipients of divine secrets of heaven and earth that had been passed down through certain initiates. There is an ancient belief that the mythical ancestors of the human race were men of superb wisdom, and there are many tales concerning Enoch and Noah as holders of divine secrets. These stories occur in much of the apocalyptic literature, and although as ancient as the book of Genesis, they clearly come from some other unidentified source. We believe that this source could be the oral secrets of the resurrection ceremony, as there has long been an unexplained secret tradition attached to the name of Enoch. In Masonic literature, there are old rituals associated with the attempt by Sem, Japhet, and Ham to resurrect Noah, and we have already mentioned a Masonic side degree known as the Ark Mariners, which continues this tradition of the secrets of Noah. But there is an even more important aspect of secret teachings of the apocalyptic tradition, which is connected with both which is connected with both Moses and Ezra, who was known as the second Moses. It is now believed that there was once a far larger body of writings attributed to Moses than have survived to the present day. One such work that has survived is the Assumption of Moses, which is known to be an Essene work. It contains the following instruction given by Moses to Joshua. Quote, "Receive thou this writing, that thou mayest know how to preserve the books which I shall deliver unto thee, and thou shalt set them in order, and anoint them with oil of cedar, and put them away in earthen vessels, in the place which he made from the beginning of the creation of the world." End quote. This reference is talking of secret books which Moses gave to Joshua to be kept hidden. Quote, "Until the day of repentance, in the visitation wherewith the Lord shall visit thee in consummation of the end of the days." End quote. The secret works connected to Moses immediately stood out to us because he was the only man to know the secrets of the Egyptian kings from first-hand experience, and he here gives instructions that at some point prior to the end of days, these secrets must be deposited in the place which he made from the beginning of the creation of the world, quote unquote. Excuse me. This description only one, I'm sorry, start that again. This described only one place to the Jews, the rock beneath the Holy of Holies in the inner sanctum of the temple in Jerusalem, because this was the first point of creation. We know that the Qumranians hid the main library of scrolls that they had written down themselves, plus other texts drawn in from around Judea in the caves behind the settlement. We also know that they were devout students of the law, so they must have followed this instruction from Moses because it was certain that they absolutely believed that the end of the age would have happened in their lifetime. It follows that if the Knights Templar excavated towards and underneath the Holy of Holies, as we were increasingly confident they must have found these secret scrolls. We were extremely excited at this point. Had we really found an explicit instruction to bury the secrets handed down from Moses under Herod's temple? Such a discovery would instantly turn a compelling theory into an odds-on probability. We immediately decided to investigate further the background to the assumption of Moses. We found that scholarly opinion said that was probably written during the lifetime of Jesus, and that it surveys Jewish history down to the Seleucid era, and then on through the Hasmonean period to someone who is described as an insolent king. This reference is commonly held to be to Herod the Great. The book goes on to describe a period of persecution which fits the times of Antiochus Epiphanes, the successor to Herod, and many scholars think this chapter has been misplaced and should stand earlier. Then a mysterious figure, Taxo, appears. He urges his sons to retire with him to a cave, to die there rather than be disloyal to their faith. Their death is to be the trigger for the expected intervention of God in history and the establishment of his kingdom. This kingdom appears to be understood as a heavenly kingdom rather than one established on earth. Many attempts have been made to identify Taxo with a historical character, but none have been really successful so far. Some writers have attempted to identify him as the teacher of righteousness. We now had the confirmation of an instruction from Moses to bury the secrets, but we also had a dating which put the origin of the scroll no earlier than the years of Jesus' life, a time when the whole community was preparing for the great battle before the end of the age. But it was the mention of an unidentified character called Taxo that excited us. We already knew that Taxo and how did they say to pronounce that? Oh, Tacho. Oh, they wrote it out as Tacho instead of Tajo. Taxo and Tacho were forms of the same name, and that the Atbash cipher translates Tacho to Asaph, the man who assisted Solomon at the building of the first temple at Jerusalem, and a name used by Freemasons for the Grand Master. Team Never Tilt is rating. Ooh, all right. Hello. How are you tonight? Thank you for the raid. Thank you, thank you. Coming in to hear about Tacho. Thank you again. Thank you for the raid. We are about not quite 10 pages from the end of the chapter. So settle in, and I will continue here. The name Taxo was no longer a mystery because the discovery of the Atbash cipher used by the Qumranians in their scrolls does confirm earlier suspicions that it refers to the master of the community, i.e., the teacher of righteousness of the last years of their existence. The exhortation in the text, quote, to die rather than be disloyal to their faith, end quote, is also highly reminiscent of the third degree of Freemasonry, which is entirely oriented to the idea of faithfulness even unto death, summed up by the words of Hiram Abif when he is threatened by the first of his attackers. Quote, I would rather suffer death than betray the sacred trust reposed in me. End quote. Our conclusion from this evidence is that the leader of the Qumran community was considered to be the spiritual descendant of the original builder of the Temple of Solomon, the man that Freemasons now know as Hiram Abif. The links with the ritual of the Masonic third degree now seemed to be fitting into our historical jigsaw pattern, but the other main motif of Masonic symbolism still required further explanation. We needed to discover how the story of the two pillars, which is so important in the first two degrees of Freemasonry, could possibly have been transmitted to the Templars. Ooh, we're getting all kinds of stuff here. Okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. You end streaming. Um, I am not ending the stream for another 10 pages. Hello, Forthurst. Welcome. Welcome in. Thank you. I don't know if Meneth is the best, but thank you. Thank you for the plug. Okay, the twin pillars. Because the Roman Church falsely positioned itself as the inheritors of the teachings of Jesus, and because modern Christians erroneously believe that they have some right to the high ground from which to study other groups, they look upon the Essenes/Qumranians as just one group amongst many that existed in the Holy Land at the time of Christ. This is a hopelessly inadequate assessment of the Qumran community. Its members were the distillation of everything that was important to the Jews as a nation, the guardians of the covenant of their God, and the embodiment of all the aspirations of a people. They were Jewishness in fine focus. So, by the way, this is what we're reading. We're reading the Hiram Key. So, um, okay, moving on. Continuing on. A key point of discussion over the years has been the identity of the individual described as the teacher of righteousness. But with the amount of information now available, many scholars believe that there must have been not one but two individuals given this title, the first at the founding of the community and the other at the end of the age, quote unquote. The difficulty is that the Qumran community was not a static thing, but a thriving, rapidly evolving group that had to continually change to meet the pressure brought to bear upon it. Consequently, the older scrolls refer to the first teacher of righteousness, and the later ones are talking about a later spiritual leader who is identifiable as James the Just. Professors Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise have concluded as independent observers that this leader of the Qumranians was James, the brother of Christ, and the leader of the Jerusalem church. It follows that the Jerusalem church was the Qumran community. An early reference to this was made by the 2nd century historian uh, Hegesippus, who called James the brother of Christ, James the Just, described him as a Nazarite, and said that he interceded in the sanctuary of the temple for the sake of the people. The same observer described James as the righteous, saying that he drank no wine and ate no animal flesh. He wore the white linen robes of a priest and had knees hard like a camel's from constant prayer. According to another scroll known as the Manual of Discipline, the council of the community consisted of 12 perfect and holy men who were the pillars of the community, and we believe that the two principal pillars were highly symbolic, representing the kingly and the priestly aspects of creating and maintaining the kingdom of heaven. We bore in mind that this term never did mean anything otherworldly. Rather, it pointed to an earthly existence where Yahweh would rule over the Jews in a permanent state of peace and prosperity. These spiritual pillars were, of course, the descendants of the pillars of the united Upper and Lower Egypt that had come down to the community as the legendary Boaz and Yakin that had adorned the eastern gate of Solomon's temple. To these pious and cornered Jews, the columns represented both the kingly power of Mishpat and the priestly power of Tzedek, and when united they supported the great archway of heaven, the keystone of which was the third great word of Hebrew desire, shalom. This Qumranian world view became particularly clear to us reading through vast amounts of information from the scrolls, from the Bible, and other contemporary literature. Since we have the advantage of our knowledge of Freemasonry and the origins of Hiram Abif, others have seen all the parts in a fragmented and confused way, but when the broad shape of the late Qumran community / early church is properly perceived, all of the confusion and apparent contradictions evaporate. The diagram shown here illustrates this important twin pillar paradigm, showing Mishpat or Boaz, Tzedek or Yakin, and Shalom. And I will show you that. I will show you that illustration. Come on, there we go. Mishpat, Shalom, Tzedek. Okay. Need $3. Menace, do you have any Stephen King books? Love Stephen King books. I do not have any Stephen King books. On this particular stream, I read pretty much nonfiction stuff. So I do read. I'm doing a Star Wars reading. That's on Mondays. But that's all the Star Wars material from the last 40 years, minus the Disney Wars stuff. But that's the only fiction that I'm reading at this particular time. Okay. The right-hand pillar is known to Freemasons as Yakin, who was the first high priest of the temple, and therefore it will come as no surprise to learn that this is the priestly pillar, which for the Qumranians was the embodiment of holiness embodied in the fundamental concept of tzedek. This word, sometimes shown spelt Zedek, Z-E-D-E-K, stood for the principle underlying the divinely appointed order, usually translated as righteousness, although it has been said that a better definition in English would be rightness, or doing good to others at all times. In other words, this concept is fundamentally the same as the ancient Egyptian concept of Ma'at. It is clear that from our readings that tzedek was for Canaanites a term associated with the sun god. The Canaanite sun god was seen as the great judge who watched over the world, righted wrongs, and shone light onto the dark doings of hidden crimes. When the Jews merged Canaanite beliefs into their concept of Yahweh, tzedek became one of his features. All the virtues of Yahweh, from feeding the people to making the crops grow to destroying Israel's enemies was a part of tzedek. The word kept its association with the light of the sun and helped to become the opposite of darkness and chaos. Although sun worship is too common in the many theologies that stem from the Sumerian civilization to make any special point out of it, there are interesting similarities between the main Egyptian deity Amun-Re, or Amun-Ra, they write it as Re, R-E, and Yahweh here, in that both of them use their beneficial power of daylight to fight the forces of darkness and chaos. The left-hand pillar of King Solomon's temple was called Boaz, who, as any Freemason knows, was the great-grandfather of David, king of Israel. For the Qumranians, too, this was the kingly pillar that stood for the house of David and the concept of mishpat. This is often translated judgment, but it stood for more than that. It signified the regular rule of Yahweh as king, and so represented the divinely appointed order itself. The rule of government and the dispensing of justice were always connected with this pillar. It was at Mizpah, another spelling of mishpat, that is M-I-Z-P-A-H, that Jacob erected his first pillar, and it was here that Saul was acclaimed the first king of Israel. When these two spiritual pillars are in place with the teacher of righteousness, Tzedek, on the left hand of God, and the earthly Davidic king, Mishpat, on the right hand, the archway of Yahweh's rule will be in place with the keystone of Shalom, locking everything together at its center. This Jewish term is perhaps the most famous of all Hebrew words, understood the world over as a form of greeting that means peace. The state is not being at war, but needless to say, it had a far more complex import for the Jews of the Bible. For the Qumranians, shalom meant much more than just peace. It involved good fortune, prosperity, victory in war, and general good fortune and well-being. But shalom was not a free gift. It had to be won by establishing the rule of Yahweh, which meant establishing a moral order of government supported by both the kingly and priestly pillars. The whole essence and mission of the Qumran community was made comprehensible to its senior members through this symbolism, which they wrote down as per the Midrashic instructions of Moses and buried under Herod's temple, later to be rediscovered by the Knights Templar. Freemasons have inherited the symbols but have lost the meaning along the way. When the Qumranians knew that the end of the age was drawing near, the need to find the people who were fit to be these pillars became urgent, because God could not destroy the old order until the new framework was in place. Because these positions were designate rather than immediately available due to the Roman occupation and the false high priesthood in Jerusalem, the candidates were called messiahs, essentially leaders in waiting. The more we discovered of the Qumranian pillar paradigm, the more certain we became that their ceremonies had to be the forerunners of Freemasonry today. We became particularly excited when we looked into the remains of Qumran and found that they had erected an imitation temple entrance with their own copies of the pillars of Boaz and Yakin. The two pillar bases still exist outside the east door of a vestry that leads to what is often referred to as Qumran's Holy of Holies. We could not believe that it was mere coincidence that the only two pillar bases found in the ruins of the whole settlement are either side of the eastern gate to this substitute place of worship. These two pillars must have been the location for the all-important initiation ceremony of senior members and the aspiration for the two messiahs that would come shortly before the end of the age. The Qumranian works we call the Dead Sea Scrolls are full of important information for our investigation, and we were particularly thrilled to find a reference to the secret of the pillars in a fragment in fragment 4 of a scroll known as the Brontologion. The name Qumran itself is considered to be the modern Arabic word for the location of the Essene monastery, and a word that has no meaning. However, we later found that this is not true when we were fortunate enough to come across a copy of a book by the late John Allegro that provides a full translation of the Copper Scroll. Allegro, a Semitic philologist, could see a clear root meaning to the word Qumran. He describes its origins and states that it would have been called Qimron, Qimron, at the time of Jesus and James. The meaning that Allegro detected meant nothing to him, and he mentioned in his book as an interesting aside. And okay. But to us, it was of explosive interest. The verbal root of Qumran is given as vault, arch, doorway, or the like. The Qumranians identified themselves with an arched doorway, but put more precisely, they were the people of the pillars with the arch over it. The doorway was created by the pillars of Tzedek and Mishpat, with the holy arch of Shalom. Here was unarguably powerful proof of our thesis connecting the community of Jesus and James with modern Freemasonry. The commonality was going far further than we had ever expected. Freemasons say that the meaning of the word yakin is to establish. It was the task of the priestly or tzedek Messiah to establish righteousness in the land of Israel so the temple could be rebuilt. The left-hand pillar Boaz is said by Freemasons to mean strength. This is the pillar of the kingly or mishpat Messiah, who would be responsible for the strength of the kingdom in defense from outsiders and in civil law and governmental matters. And Freemasons say that when the two are united, stability is the result. There could be no better single word translation for the concept of shalom. The bottom line is that modern Freemasons use the two pillars of King Solomon's temple in exactly the same way that the Qumran community and Jesus the Christ did. Fragments of a testament to Levi, which is probably older than the version of the testament of Levi contained in the Bible, have been found in the Qumran caves. In this document, there are references to the Messiah, which seems to indicate writings came from circles who expected a Levitical priestly Messiah rather than a Davidic kingly one. The translations of the document we have seen would appear to indicate that the writers expected a priestly leader alongside a civil leader, with the civil subordinate to the priestly. Many other Qumranian texts, such as the Damascus document, with its references to the messiahs of Aaron, priestly, and Israel, kingly, confirm these ideas, but the less well-known but powerful testament to Levi makes the point clearly. In Matthew 3:3, John the Baptist is described as, quote, a voice crying in the wilderness, end quote. This is, in the precise form, words used by the Qumran community, and it suggested to us that the gospel writers had a struggle to turn scriptures around to make Jesus come out as the Messiah. It also makes reference to the fact that even as late as the time of the writings of Luke's gospel, it was remembered that people held John the Baptist to be the Messiah. Luke says in chapter 3, verse 15, quote, and as the people were in expectation, and all men mused in their hearts of John, whether he were the Christ or not, end quote. This verse is probably skimmed over by most Christians who use their scriptures for personal inspiration rather than historical understanding, but it does communicate a key point. The choice of the words all men rather than some men indicates that everybody saw John as a prime candidate for being a Messiah. That John and Jesus were joint messiahs has been accepted by many members of the traditional theological community for the last 40 years. As we discussed earlier, the Mandeans of southern Iraq are descendants of the Nazarenes, and they claim that John the Baptist was the originator of their sect, which came into being at the point in time when the Qumranians became a distinct cult instead of being just an introverted Essene-style community such as those found at Ephesus, Turkey, or on the island of Elephantine in Egypt. This evidence will frighten many Christians because it seems so alien and threatening to their belief that their Jesus Christ was the one and only Messiah. But this is only a problem to those who cling to the Hellenized supernatural corruption of the Hebrew term. If the word is given its original correct meaning, it is quite natural to see John as the priestly Messiah and Jesus as the Mishpat pillar, the kingly Messiah. John lived a hard life in the wilderness, cleansing the spirit of the people by submerging them in the running waters of the river Jordan. That was the preferred techniques of the Qumranians, who usually had to make do with the static water of their cisterns. He was the personification of Qumranian righteousness, eating only such permissible food as locusts and wild honey, and wearing a leather girdle and a coat of camel hair. In John's view, the entire Jerusalem establishment was totally corrupt. So, as he preached excoriating sermons against it, and he urged his congregation to repent. He urged his congregation to repent and to accept the Essene/Qumranian rite of purification by baptism. Some observers believe that John was the teacher of righteousness, but whilst it may be true, we have been unable to find sufficient evidence to support this view. The story of the baptism of Jesus described in the New Testament is a deliberately enhanced account created by the later gospel writers to keep up the level of magical events to satisfy a Gentile audience. But the reconstructed source material can shed useful light on the relationship between these two important men. This reveals that the idea that John baptized Jesus was an invention by Mark, and that John only became aware that Jesus existed when his disciples told him about a new wise teacher who had arrived from the north, claiming even that a Roman centurion had shown more belief in the power of God than the average Jew. Jesus must have been a central figure in the Qumran community, and being of the line of David, as well as a very talented student, it is likely that the so-called baptism by John was Jesus' first level of initiation into the Qumran community. The description of Jesus seeing a dove descend upon him was a standard Hebrew way of expressing the gaining of wisdom. It is even more interesting to look at what happened to Jesus after his baptism. According to the New Testament, he went into the wilderness where he fasted for 40 days and nights. It does not say that he left the wilderness after the fasting. Indeed, the King James Bible tells us that he remained there for 3 years, from AD 27 to 31, and it is important to note that the term the wilderness is used throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls as the description of the Qumran community. It was an inability to understand contemporary usage of wilderness that caused Christians to imagine Jesus alone in an actual desert. We can now be clear about its meaning. Jesus was at Qumran, passing through the 3 stages of initiation to reach the highest level of the brotherhood, each of which, you will recall, took precisely 1 year. Here he learned how to face the temptations of Satan and turn his back on the bribes of the leaders of other nations. At the last stage, after his 3 years, he was taught the secret techniques and words of resurrection handed down from Moses, which raised a candidate from his figurative tomb to live a faithful and righteous life, ready for the coming of the kingdom of God. It is fairly certain that Jesus lived for a year thereafter by the community's strict sectarian rules, but after John's death in early AD 32, he decided that the fastest and most efficient way to get the people of Israel into shape for the coming kingdom of heaven was to bend the rules, a case of the end justifying the means. From all of the information available to us, we have to deduce that Jesus and his brother his brother James must have been star pupils and highly qualified Qumranians. As a gifted teacher from the line of David, John the Baptist asked Jesus if he would be the one to come, that is, the kingly Messiah, to form his opposite pillar. Jesus answered the question with a Pesher response. Quote, "The blind recover their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are given the good news." End quote. In no way did he mean that he had done all these things. He was referring to the miracles of healing that Isaiah predicted would happen at the time of Israel's restoration. This was a confirmation that Jesus agreed with John that the end of the age was imminent, and he was the man to help prepare the way. All physical and mental illnesses were considered to be the result of a sinful life, and a driving out of sin would cure the malady. When it comes to Jesus' expressed view of John in the reconstructed gospel, the message is clear. Quote, "You knew that John was a prophet, and not to expect royal garments when you saw him, but what you did not know, and what I now tell you, is that John was more than a prophet. He was the one about whom it is written, 'Look, I am sending my messenger before you. I will prepare your path ahead of you.'" End quote. Okay, we're almost done. We've got just barely over 2 pages. This early Christian text incorrectly implies that it is Jesus who has marked out John as the priestly Messiah, rather than John spotting Jesus as the kingly Messiah. The passage states lucidly that whilst John is the preordained one, people should not expect royal garments because he will not be the king. Many people have been confused by passages in which Jesus describes John as the one to come, and John describes Jesus with the same words. Once it is realized that the two of them were pillars in the heavenly gateway, it becomes clear that there is no conflict at all. Each needed the other. The messianic ministry of John the Baptist lasted only 6 years, as he was beheaded early in AD 32. Josephus records in Antiquities that he was killed by Herod Antipas, who feared that John's activities would lead to a revolt because of his messianic nature. It must have come as a major blow to Jesus to hear that his opposite pillar had been murdered. The Qumran community and all of their followers must have been devastated by the loss of one pillar ahead of the end of the age and the arrival of the kingdom of God. Despite the rarity of people holy enough to be considered as John's replacement, 2 candidates appear to have stepped quickly forward to fill this key role. One was to become the leader of the Qumran community, known as James the Just, and the other was the elder brother, the man we call Jesus. Once we started studying the New Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls with our new rock-solid knowledge of the importance of twin pillars, whole new meanings were clear to see. We wondered how on earth everybody else had missed the obvious, but then no one had ever connected the rituals of Freemasonry in the ancient Egyptians with this period before. The vein of investigation that we were mining was rich beyond our expectations, and we could only hope that our good fortune would hold out as we started to look more closely at the life of the kingly pillar, Jesus the Christ himself. Okay, and then we have the conclusion for this chapter. Conclusion. Our review of the Holy Land at the time of Jesus has led us to the conclusion that the Qumran community was, despite its tiny size, the most important group for our quest. We knew that they were authors of the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we had now come to the firm view that the Qumran community, Essenes, Nazarenes, and the Jerusalem church were all names for the same group. When reviewing the Hasmonean period, we came across the fact that the Roman Catholic Bible is at odds with the King James Bible in that the first and second books of Maccabees had been removed from the latter. The Catholics portray the Hasmoneans as Jewish heroes, yet the Protestants clearly do not. This strongly indicated a connection between the anti-Hasmonean Cumranians and the 17th century English establishment, something that could only have happened through a Templar/Freemasonry route. We had found many connections between the Cumranians and Freemasonry, from their grading procedures to their banning of coins or other metallic objects during initiation. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that they focused on truth, righteousness, kindness, justice, honesty, and humility, along with brotherly love. This made their position as the spiritual descendants of the Egyptian kings and the antecedents of the Templars and Freemasonry seem certain to us. From the scrolls, we had also learned that there were in existence secret books that contained references to certain rituals revealed by God that were normally transmitted to selected people by word of mouth alone, but had now been written down in coded form. These secrets were highly restricted, and it is claimed that they had been handed down in a long line of secret tradition. Additionally, we had come across a definite reference to the secrets of the pillars. Our early suspicion that the Knights Templar had excavated the Holy of Holies and found secret writings had been supported by the Qumranian assumption of Moses, which instructed the community to conceal its most precious scrolls in that precise location. Without doubt, the leader of the Qumran community was considered to be the spiritual descendant of the original builder of the Temple of Solomon, the man that Freemasons now know as Hiram Abiff, and we are convinced that James, the brother of Christ, was James the Just, of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the leader of the Jerusalem Church. The essence of the Qumranian pillar paradigm became clear as Tzedek on the left-hand side of the gateway and Mishpat on the right hand, with Yahweh, the keystone of Shalom, locking everything together at its center. John the Baptist and Jesus were joint messiahs for a time, but after the killing of John, the politics of the situation had exploded. We now needed to try and find out exactly what was going on during this key period, most particularly between Jesus and James. And that is the end of that chapter. And that is enough for my voice for one night. So, and Forthurst, you said you loved the Star Wars franchise. I do too. I've loved it since the very beginning. I was around when the original movie, A New Hope, came out in theaters in '78, and I got to see it there, and I've been a fan ever since. So that is why I do not consider the Disney Wars stuff to be Star Wars. It may share some of the same stuff, but it is not Star Wars. Anyway, let's see if there's anybody around that we want to raid to, if you'll stick around for a couple minutes. I do see that Mr. Blitzer is on. He's playing Cyberpunk 2077. Hot Dog Raw Dog is playing Sonic. And Vesper Vidya Retro is playing some retro thing, except that's what he does. I'm going to go on over to Vesper. If you'll bear with me for just a couple minutes, give him 2 minutes of your time if you would, or more. You can stick around, and I will take us on over there, and I'll see you there.
Shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Just tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now.
Dude, that boss was intense, though.